you ready to have a true, open, honest discussion about this whole Nolan Wells case? Huh? Okay, let's do it. What if Nolan had looked like this? What if he had been a white boy? You think for a second would not been handcuffed the motherfucking second they brought that phone back to that mama? Think for a second every major fucking influencer in the world would have been jumping on board on this, saying something's fishy about this? Because he's black, it's different. You don't believe me? Okay, let's do this real quick. Since July 4th, how many videos of these teen takeover mobs have you seen that look like this? Or this? And how many have you seen that look like this? I bet not a fucking lot. Simple fucking fact of the matter is, media, in particular, social fucking media, wants to paint the black community as a bunch of fucking wild animals. So that when situations like the Nolan Wells situations occurs, nobody gives a fuck. Well, you know what? That's why in my bio here it says champion for motherfucking all. I don't give a fuck about your race. I don't care who you fuck. I don't care about your politics. And I don't give a fuck about the color of your skin. Something about this case is fucking fishy. Something is off. And even if those boys didn't do it themselves, stop calling them his fucking friends, because they left that young man on the island with fucking strangers and he never came home. That's the bottom fucking line. Don't you dare tell me that if Nolan had looked like this right here, things would not have been handled differently, because they abso-fucking-lutely would have. Those of you in my comment section saying don't make this about fucking race, pull your fucking head out of your ass and wake the fuck up until you admit that people of all colors are treated fucking differently in this country. Specifically when it comes to shit like what happened to Nolan Wells, you will always be a part of the fucking problem and not a part of the fucking solution.
They killed Nolan Wells on the boat. They covered him up with the life jackets. They all knew he was on the boat. They just laid him on the back of the boat and got towed in part of the way. Then they got their boat running and they got on in. And when they got in, they couldn't figure out where they were going to put him or what they were going to do. So they dropped everybody off. Then they went back out to the island that the GPS doesn't show, but they did, because they disconnected it. Okay? And none of them had their phones with them when they went back. So there wasn't any trace of them going back. And they dumped the body. They came back, took the boat out of the water, then went over there at 3 a.m. and washed the boat, thinking washing the boat would get all the DNA and everything off the boat.
Now, after you've listened to it, I'm sure that you got the same thing that I have. I don't think that he's describing what happened, or like if he had firsthand knowledge of what happened and things of that nature. I think what he is doing is saying that this is what he heard on one of the panel's lives or something of that nature. And he is saying that these content creators, TikTok creators, we are the best investigators out there, and that the police or investigators, or if there are any in this case, should look into the things that we have researched, because he feels that we're spot on.
A photograph was watched by nearly 1 million people as they picked it apart frame by frame in a single night. It shows 18-year-old Nolan Wells standing in a pool, laughing and surrounded by friends. For several days in July, people online treated that image as proof that Nolan had somehow been alive after the night he was believed to have drowned. Entire theories were built around it, and some of those claims are still being repeated. But the photograph was actually taken 8 days before Nolan died. That is where we begin today. This is not only about what happened to Nolan Wells on a barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast on July 4th, but also about what happened after his disappearance and the discovery of his body. In the weeks that followed, the case seemed to develop two separate narratives. One is based on statements from the sheriff's department, GPS information, and the legal process surrounding the investigation. The other grew through comment sections, TikTok videos, screenshots, and posts that were often shared faster than anyone could determine where the information originally came from. Both sides say they want the truth. The important question is which claims can actually stand up when they are compared with evidence. By the end of this video, you'll have a clearer picture of what has been established, which viral claims have weakened under basic scrutiny, and which questions remain unanswered. There is a major difference between a genuine mystery and a rumor that keeps getting repeated. In the Nolan Wells case, those two things have become difficult to separate. So let's begin with Nolan himself, before his name became a trending topic. And if you're new here, this channel is focused on separating confirmed information from claims that only sound convincing online, especially when a case is still developing. If you want updates based on actual developments rather than just the latest viral post, make sure you're subscribed. Ocean Springs, Mississippi, is a Gulf Coast community located a short distance from Biloxi. Nolan Xavier Wells grew up there. He graduated from Ocean Springs High School and later attended Southwest Mississippi Community College, where he played wide receiver. He was only 18. People who knew Nolan often described him in remarkably similar ways. He was outgoing, friendly, and comfortable around people he had just met. Friends and family remembered someone who could enter a room and quickly make a connection. His mother, Christine Wansley, has publicly described the evening before he left for the 4th of July holiday. Nolan had cooked salmon for dinner before he went to spend the night with friends. As he was leaving, he told his mother, "Hey, Mom, I'm about to go. I love you." He hugged and kissed her, then walked out. That was the last time Christine saw her son in person. People close to Nolan also remembered how much he enjoyed taking pictures and sharing moments from his life. His family has described him as someone who liked documenting what he was doing and who could even ask his mother to take another picture of him before going to bed. That small detail becomes important later because questions about photographs, phones, and digital records have become part of the larger discussion surrounding the case. On July 4, 2026, Nolan traveled to Horn Island with friends to celebrate Independence Day. Horn Island is a barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast and is part of Gulf Island's national seashore. There are no normal residential developments there, and access is primarily by boat. On a busy holiday, the area can become crowded with boats, music, and groups gathering along the sand. According to the accounts made public so far, Nolan was last seen on the island sometime in the afternoon, with witnesses placing the timing around 3 to 4 p.m. He was wearing blue swim trunks and sunglasses. Friends said he had been socializing and talking with a young woman he had met during the day. Then the accounts begin to separate. Before getting into those differences, it helps to understand how the search unfolded, because the timeline of the response has also raised questions. One of Nolan's friends was the first person to notify the U.S. Coast Guard. According to the Coast Guard, that notification came at approximately 11 p.m. on July 4th. The initial notification did not require Coast Guard assistance, but it established that someone was already reporting Nolan missing that night. Christine Wansley later contacted authorities as well. A redacted incident report reported by the Biloxi Sun-Herald says she contacted the Jackson County Sheriff's Department at 12:22 a.m. on July 5th after first checking with other agencies about where the missing person report should be made. A broader search followed, involving the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, the U.S. Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service, and the United Cajun Navy. The response eventually became a large multi-agency effort covering both the island and surrounding waters. On July 6th, a National Park Service ranger found Nolan's body in the water off the northwestern portion of Horn Island, close to the general area where he had last been seen. Some early reporting and online posts have described different details about how Nolan was identified. Those details should be handled carefully. At this point, the public record has contained conflicting descriptions, so it is safer not to treat every version circulating online as established fact. What authorities said publicly in the early stages was that there was no information indicating foul play. Sheriff John Ledbetter said investigators had not found information suggesting a crime had occurred, while officials also reported no immediately obvious signs of physical trauma. That initial explanation led many people to view the case as a tragic drowning or accident. But Nolan's parents did not feel the public explanation answered all of their questions. One of the first issues they focused on was Nolan's phone. According to Christine Wansley's public account, the family used Life 360, a location-sharing application, to track Nolan's phone after he disappeared. The phone appeared to be back on the mainland and in the possession of one of Nolan's friends rather than remaining on Horn Island with him. That raised an obvious question for the family. If Nolan was still on the island, why was his phone somewhere else? When the family eventually recovered the phone, Christine said she and her sister examined it, including Nolan's Snapchat activity. According to her account, they did not find the kind of July 4th activity they expected. She said there were no saved photos or Snapchat posts from that day. That absence has become a major point of discussion because the family has described Nolan as someone who frequently documented his life. But there is an important distinction here. A missing Snapchat record does not, by itself, establish what happened to Nolan. It is a piece of information that raises questions, but it does not answer them. The same is true of many of the other details circulating around this investigation. The boat timeline is one example. According to the accounts released publicly, the boat carrying Nolan and his friends developed a mechanical problem involving its bilge pump, the pump used to remove water from inside the boat. Around the afternoon, the group decided to return toward the mainland. Nolan did not go back with them. His friends said he chose to stay behind because he wanted to continue talking with a young woman he had met. The explanation given publicly was that he planned to find another ride back, either with her or with another boat in the larger group. Another important detail concerns the phones. According to an account attributed to one of the friends, Nolan's phone remained on the boat along with phones belonging to other people who did not want their devices exposed to water. That creates a timeline that has attracted intense attention online. Nolan remained on the island, his phone traveled back to the mainland, and his friends returned without him. But again, the existence of an unusual timeline is not the same thing as proof of a crime. The investigation has also involved GPS information from the boat. Publicly reported data obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources showed that the boat left a private dock at approximately 9:56 a.m. on July 4th and reached Horn Island around 11:14 a.m. Those records matter because GPS data can help investigators compare what people remember with what the boat actually did. If a witness describes a particular movement at a particular time, investigators can potentially compare that account against digital records. The FBI has also been assisting the Jackson County Sheriff's Department with digital evidence. Sheriff John Ledbetter said the federal agency's involvement was connected in part to Horn Island being federal land and that FBI personnel were helping with forensic examination of digital evidence. That does not automatically mean the FBI has concluded that a crime occurred. It means investigators have access to additional resources and expertise while the case remains active. This is where the difference between evidence and speculation becomes especially important. Online, people have circulated claims about photographs, videos, arguments, deleted material, phone records, and the movements of people on the island. Some of those claims may eventually become relevant to the official investigation. Others may turn out to be misunderstandings, edited clips, or information taken out of context. Investigators have repeatedly asked people with original photographs, videos, audio, or first-hand information to come forward. That request matters because original material can be checked for its date, metadata, and context, while reposted screenshots and edited clips are much harder to authenticate. For now, the confirmed picture is still incomplete. Nolan went to Horn Island with friends on July 4th. His friends returned to the mainland without him. Authorities received a missing person notification that night. A large search followed. Nolan's body was found in the water on July 6th. His family has questioned whether the initial explanation tells the whole story, and investigators continue to examine the circumstances surrounding his disappearance and death. So there are still real questions here. Why did Nolan remain on the island? What happened during the period after his friends left? Who was with him, and what did those people see? What can the phone records, GPS information, photographs, and videos actually establish? And what will the official investigation ultimately conclude? Those questions deserve answers. But they also deserve patience. Nolan Wells was a young athlete from Ocean Springs whose family is still looking for a clear explanation of how he died. The facts that can be independently checked should remain at the center of the story, while rumors should be treated as rumors until evidence supports them. And as more records, interviews, or official findings become public, that timeline may become clearer. Until then, the unanswered questions are real, but the answers should come from evidence rather than from whatever claim happens to be trending next.
Guy lied during the interview with Brandon Tatum, and not only did he lie, the lie he told is extremely problematic. I did a really full breakdown of this on a YouTube video if you want to go watch my complete analysis and input. He said the last time he saw Nolan Wells was 3 o'clock.
The last time I saw Nolan was 3 o'clock.
But then like 2-3 minutes later in the interview, he's talking about how they found the boat taken on water and had to be towed out, and it was 4:30, an hour and a half past 3 o'clock. And he said this.
Nolan was sitting by the boat with that Katie girl.
So wait a minute. If the last time you saw Nolan was at 3 o'clock, then how did you know he was beside the boat with Katie McCormick at 4:30? Also, Katie McCormick's the person that they keep saying is who he said, I'm going to stay behind with. But Katie McCormick herself disputes that, and he disputes that in this same interview.
And I heard the girl that he was with, Katie, had text somebody that she heard people yelling
Correct.
for Nolan to get on it. Is that true?
And I have a picture of that. She texted my buddy, and the next day everybody was panicking and everybody's texting Katie, because she was obviously seen with Nolan the whole day at the island. Katie sent a message to my buddy the next day and said, this is the last time I saw him, he's really sweet. But she also mentioned that the last time she saw Nolan was when my buddy was yelling at him to get on the boat.
This is a red flag from hell. Anytime you're talking about the timeline of events on the day in question, especially as it pertains around the last time someone was seen alive, he says Wyatt was yelling for Nolan from the boat. Get on the boat. Get the fuck on the boat, Nolan. He says that Katie's text message confirms she saw Nolan by the boat at 4:30, and he says that Nolan was on the boat, beside the boat at 4:30. So everybody says he was beside the boat at 4:30, and then they didn't take him with them. According to them, he stayed behind, but nobody else, the thousands of people on Horn Island, saw him after 4:30. 4:30 is the last time that we saw him alive, and that's when we caught you in this lie. Not only is 3 o'clock not the last time you've seen him, according to your own contradiction, but Katie McCormick contradicts that he stayed with her. This is a major red flag. It's not just a casual deception, casual lie. It's about the last time he was seen alive. Also, this entire Brandon Tatum interview thing is completely looks scripted, edited, and polished to complete a narrative. And from all indications, he's doing it jointly with the family. So in a scripted interview that's joint with the family, a little narrative spin interview, you still have this much deception. This is a problem.
Then there are the keys. Nolan's car keys reportedly ended up in the driveway of a friend's home. They were not handed directly to his family, and they were not simply dropped off at their house. Instead, the family had to go and retrieve them, much like they had to track down Nolan's phone. For a family already searching for answers, having to locate these personal belongings themselves only added another layer of frustration. Then comes the clothing discrepancy. Police records listed Nolan Wells as wearing black shorts on the day he disappeared. Christine Wansley, however, said photographs shared with her by someone who was on Horn Island that day showed Nolan wearing blue swim trunks. By itself, a difference like that could have a simple explanation. Clothing descriptions can be remembered incorrectly, especially when people are recalling events hours or days later, and secondhand descriptions can be even less reliable. Still, in a case already filled with unanswered questions, every small inconsistency becomes something investigators have to sort through. Families should not have to piece together basic details on their own, but that is what the Wansleys say they have been doing. Then there is the friend group's account of Nolan's final afternoon, And this is where a significant contradiction appears. According to family attorney Ben Crump, a young woman on the island, later identified publicly as Katie McCormick, told the family through her sister that Nolan said he was going back to the boat he had arrived on. The friends who were on that boat have described the situation differently. Their account was that Nolan told them he wanted to stay behind with Katie. Those two versions do not line up. Someone's recollection of that conversation could be mistaken, or there could be additional context that has not yet been made public. That is not an accusation against either side. It is simply what happens when two accounts describe the same moment in different ways. Resolving that kind of discrepancy is exactly what a thorough investigation is supposed to do. Nolan's best friend, Javon Williams, has also spoken publicly about the final afternoon. Reports identify him as Nolan's best friend, and he was on Horn Island that day after traveling separately because the original boat was at capacity. In an on-the-record interview, Javon said he last saw Nolan later in the afternoon, around 4 p.m., while Nolan was spending time with a girl and other friends. He also said both Nolan and the girl had left their phones on the boat. Javon made another point that is difficult to ignore. He said Nolan was not the type of person to stay behind while his friends left. In his view, Nolan had always been someone who returned with the people he arrived with. That statement does not prove what happened, and it should not be treated as proof of wrongdoing. But it is a first-hand description from someone who knew Nolan well, and it differs from the explanation that Nolan simply chose to remain behind. That distinction matters. A first-hand account from a close friend is stronger than a rumor circulating online, but it is still not the same thing as sworn testimony or independently verified evidence. At this stage, both the friend's account and the family's account have to be weighed alongside everything else investigators can establish. Family attorney Ben Crump, along with Reverend Al Sharpton, has publicly stood beside Nolan's parents while calling for greater transparency. Sharpton has argued that the explanation given so far does not make sense to the family. Crump has also pointed to what he describes as major inconsistencies, including the disagreement about which boat Nolan intended to take, the fact that his phone and keys returned without him, and the large number of people who were present around Horn Island that day. None of those points, standing alone or even together, automatically proves that a crime occurred. That needs to be said clearly. What they do show is why the family continues to ask questions and why the investigation deserves careful attention. The early public framing that there was no indication of foul play came before many of the later questions had been fully examined in public. Once an initial conclusion becomes widely accepted, changing that narrative later can be difficult, which is why precision matters from the beginning. Now, let's move from what people are saying to what can actually be checked. In the weeks after Nolan's body was recovered, several pieces of evidence entered the public discussion. Each provides information that witness memories alone cannot necessarily provide. NBC News obtained audio through a public records request involving a call made to a private towing service by members of Nolan's group. In the recording, someone can be heard asking for help because the boat was taking on water. A dispatcher also asked whether everyone on board was accounted for and in good condition, and a voice responded that everyone was on board. That recording supports the basic claim that the boat had a mechanical problem and that the group was trying to leave the island. But it does not independently establish whether Nolan was physically aboard at the exact moment the call was made. That distinction is important. The most closely watched period remains the gap between Nolan's last reported sighting and the boat's departure from Horn Island. Publicly reported accounts have placed Nolan's last sighting at different times, including around 3 p.m. and closer to 4 p.m. GPS records show the boat departed at approximately 4:31 p.m. That leaves a crucial window in which investigators need to determine what happened and who saw Nolan. Right now, much of the information about that period still comes from people connected to the group. CBS News reported on GPS records obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. According to those records, the vessel left its dock at about 9:56 a.m., reached Horn Island around 11:14 a.m., and departed the island at approximately 4:31 p.m. The records also show the boat returning to its original dock, traveling toward Fort Bayou and later returning again. GPS information can be extremely useful because it establishes where a vessel was at particular times. But GPS cannot tell investigators what was happening on the beach or what individual people were doing next to the boat. That is why the 3 to 4:31 p.m. period remains so important. A digital map can show movement. It cannot, by itself, explain a conversation, an argument, a decision to stay behind, or what a person may have witnessed on the island. Another significant development involved Nolan's phone. Following a meeting between the Wells-Wansley family, their attorneys and Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McClure, the family and law enforcement agreed to what has been described as a mutual inspection of the phone's data. The idea was for the family's forensic experts and law enforcement experts to examine the device's information at the same time and have access to the same findings. Legal analyst Tyler Bailey, speaking to Law and Crime's Jesse Weber, described that type of arrangement as unusual under normal circumstances because a victim's family would not ordinarily participate directly in a law enforcement forensic examination. The arrangement is important for two reasons. First, it reflects the level of pressure surrounding the investigation and the family's demand for transparency. Second, it shows how much distrust had developed between the family and investigators, to the point that both sides wanted direct access to the same information rather than relying only on the other side's interpretation. The district attorney has also said that after the sheriff's investigation is completed, the case will be presented to a grand jury. It is important to be precise about what that means. A grand jury referral in an unnatural or suspicious death does not automatically mean criminal charges are coming. It also does not mean investigators have already concluded that a crime occurred. The grand jury's role is to review evidence presented to it and determine whether that evidence supports an indictment. That is a serious legal step, but it is not a verdict. It is not a finding of guilt, and it should not be presented that way. Now we need to talk about one of the biggest problems surrounding this case: misinformation. Several pieces of material went viral after Nolan's disappearance. Large numbers of people treated them as confirmed evidence, but later information challenged those interpretations. One example was a photograph that appeared to show Nolan in a pool surrounded by other people. The image was shared alongside a claim that Nolan had somehow returned from Horn Island, attended a pool gathering, and then ended up back in the water. The claim spread quickly, but the photograph itself tells a different story. Rolling Stone reported that the image was taken on June 27 in Pass Christian, Mississippi, 8 days before the July 4th trip. A close friend of Nolan's, Trayson Shepard, identified the people shown in the photograph and confirmed the date. The date was also reportedly corroborated through metadata from another source. The fact that the photograph was uploaded on July 5th created additional confusion. People saw a picture of Nolan posted after his disappearance and assumed the image itself had been taken after July 4th. But the upload date and the date a photograph was actually taken are two completely different things. That distinction is a perfect example of how quickly an online theory can grow when people see an image without checking its original date. The theory that Nolan had returned from the island and attended a later gathering has not been established by that photograph. Its central piece of supposed evidence predates the July 4th events by more than a week. Then there was another viral video. The recording appeared to capture an argument, with a voice saying words along the lines of, "Give me my freaking phone. What are you freaking doing?" Ben Crump referenced the clip publicly, including during an appearance on Good Morning America, and said he initially believed the voice could have been Nolan's. But the person heard in the recording was later identified as Trayson Shepard, the same friend who helped establish the date of the pool photograph. Shepard spoke publicly and said the voice in the recording was his. He explained that he had been involved in a separate confrontation with another person and that friends were trying to calm him down and get him off the island. Nolan was not the person involved in that recording. Crump later acknowledged that the earlier interpretation came from what a witness had told his team and that another witness subsequently disputed it. He said his team would be more careful going forward to describe such claims as information provided by a witness rather than as confirmed facts. Both corrections are important. The people who shared the original material were often reacting to something that genuinely looked disturbing. But disturbing is not the same as verified. Before treating a photo or video as evidence, investigators and the public need to know when it was created, who appears in it, who is speaking, and what was happening around the recording. Trayson Shepard has also publicly said that he and other people connected to the friend group received death threats after coming forward. That is another troubling part of the online response. A person correcting misinformation should not become a target simply because the correction does not fit a popular theory. There is also another claim circulating online that needs to be treated carefully: the statement that no one had drowned near Horn Island in more than 6 years. As of the material reviewed for this script, that specific statistic has not been independently established through a cited state or federal records database. The claim appears to have circulated through social media discussion rather than through a clearly identified public agency report. Until a number like that can be traced to an actual record, a coroner's office, a government database, or another verifiable source, it should be described as unconfirmed rather than used as evidence that the official explanation is a cover story. The same standard applies to claims about an unnamed relative allegedly being present on the island or supposedly explaining how the towing company was contacted so quickly. Those claims may be worth investigating, but without documentation or reliable confirmation, they remain claims. And that brings us to the larger issue. The Nolan Wells investigation contains genuine, unanswered questions. The phone, the keys, the different clothing descriptions, the conflicting accounts about whether Nolan planned to return to the boat, the timing of the boat's departure, and the information from GPS records all deserve careful examination. At the same time, several viral claims have already fallen apart after basic verification. The pool photograph was taken before July 4th. The argument video was not Nolan. The claim about a 6-year absence of drownings has not been independently verified from the material reviewed here. Those corrections do not solve the case. They simply separate what can be supported from what cannot. And that distinction matters more than ever. If you are following this case, the best question is not, which theory do I believe? It is, what can actually be proven? That means watching the phone examination, following the official investigative findings, checking the GPS information against witness statements, and waiting for the grand jury process to reveal what evidence authorities believe is significant. Nolan Wells was an 18-year-old athlete from Ocean Springs. His family is still searching for a clear explanation of what happened during the final hours of his life. The unanswered questions are real, but so are the corrections to misinformation that has spread around this case. The strongest version of this story will not come from the loudest theory online. It will come from evidence that survives scrutiny, records that can be checked, and accounts that can be independently supported. Until then, the timeline remains incomplete, and the questions surrounding Nolan's final hours remain open.
This Nolan Wells story is eating me up, and so we're going to look at this from a media literacy standpoint, because I saw some really concerning reporting today where a law enforcement official was essentially blaming Nolan for his own death.
Nolan Wells was on a boat. He left from a private dock area in the Ocean Springs area and proceeded with his friends to Horn Island.
Wells was visiting the barrier island 10 miles from the Gulf Coast, boating with friends, last seen about 3 p.m. Saturday.
They left and went back without Nolan. From what we understand, he chose to stay there.
And so I know that the word gaslighting is used and not always in the right way, but this is 10 miles off the coast on a barrier island with his friends who came back. He didn't. They had his phone. They're saying that he chose to stay. Was he supposed to swim? He had no way to call him. They left him for dead. But you have a law enforcement official saying, from what they understand, he chose to stay. He's not saying from what we've been able to determine, what we've been able to confirm and verify. He's saying from what we understand. He understands that because that's what they were told. Why is he repeating what they were told from the friends who left this man to die? Why is he repeating that on national television? Then why is a news organization that has multiple layers of producers as well as a legal and standards department allowing this to be broadcast without pushing back? I didn't even hear the word suspicious in the piece. And I am a Black mother who is at my wit's end with how this country continues to gaslight us and then expects us to stay silent. Because this is not normal. The reporter can only push back so much. So this is not about the reporter. It's about the organizations that handpick the Black faces that then go out and and report these stories that are gaslighting to the American public. This is problematic. So this is how I can help, by speaking up to say, hey, let's look at this critically. Let's look through a media literacy standpoint. Let's look at the information that's being presented. Let's consider why it's being presented this way, who it's coming from, what's being left out, what questions are not being answered, what questions aren't being asked. This is not okay. This is not how this story should be being reported out. This is the impact of seeing Black and brown journalists systemically laid off, fired, not renewed. Please tag some of your favorite independent journalists below, especially independent Black and brown journalists. And share this video.
If the situations were reversed, if the circumstances were reversed, and it was 3 black boys who took a white boy out, and the 3 black boys came back and the white boy did not, it wouldn't matter that they didn't know what happened. Those 3 black boys would have been in handcuffs. Those 3 black boys would still be in questioning to this day. I can see the Fox News headline now, right? They would have used it as proof. See, we told you black people were dangerous. We told you black people were bad.
This is the part of the video I actually want you to pay the closest attention to, because it's not really about Nolan Wells specifically. It's about how a case like this one turns into what has become a real, sustained multi-week online debate involving hundreds of creators, tens of thousands of comment threads, and by some accounts 50 to 100 tips a day flowing into the family's legal team alone. It starts with a verified information gap. In the first hours after any death like this, investigators themselves have very little information. And what they do know, they're not legally or procedurally permitted to release yet. That silence isn't secrecy for its own sake. It's how investigations are supposed to work, protecting witness accounts and the integrity of evidence before anything is established. But a silence like that in 2026 does not stay empty. That distinction is important because the public record is still developing. Within hours, other people start filling it because the audience wants an answer faster than the actual process can produce one. The people filling that silence generally fall into a few recognizable categories, and it's worth understanding each one because they behave differently and warrant different levels of confidence. There are journalists working with named sources and records requests. The NBC News team that obtained a distress call audio, the CBS team that pulled the GPS data through Mississippi's Department of Marine Resources, the Rolling Stone reporters who tracked down the pool photos' actual metadata. Their work is verifiable. You can trace it back to a particular document, a particular recording, a named on-the-record source. There are legal teams working alongside law enforcement Ben Crump's office. The additional attorneys who since joined, in some cases, investigators with law enforcement backgrounds working independently, their information can generally be more reliable than pure speculation because it is tied to an actual legal strategy with consequences if it's wrong, but also comes with built-in incentive. They represent one side of a case that may eventually go to trial, which means their public comments are also to some extent advocacy. For now, that point remains part of the unresolved picture rather than a settled fact. And then there's the third category, which is where the vast majority of what you've probably seen about this case actually comes from commentary channels and individual creators operating with no official access to the investigation at all, working entirely from screenshots, indirect claims, and other creators' videos. Some of these creators are careful. They label speculation as speculation. They withdraw claims when they're wrong. They cite where a piece of information actually came from. Many are not. Many present a claim with exactly the same confident tone. Whether it comes from a court filing or from a comment someone left on a live stream an hour earlier. That's not a criticism of true crime content as a format. In other words, the available record does not justify turning uncertainty into certainty. Obviously, given what channel you're watching this on, it's a specific warning about this case because the volume of unverified claims attached to it is genuinely outpaced the volume of verified ones. And that ratio matters. When 90% of what's circulating about a case is speculation dressed up with confident language, the 10% that's actually reliable gets harder to find, not easier. Even though there's more content than ever, there's a specific mechanic worth naming here because it explains why corrections almost never travel as far as the original claim. A false or exaggerated claim about a case like this one tends to be more emotionally powerful than the correction that follows it. It's more dramatic. It fits a more compelling narrative and it usually gets posted first. while the correction requires someone to do actual verification work, which takes time the original claim never waited for. By the time Rolling Stone had traced a pool photo back to June 27th, the original version, Nolan, seen alive after Horn Island, had already reached by some estimates close to 1 million views. That is why the timeline matters so much here, especially when different accounts are being compared. The correction reached a small portion of that. This is not unique to this case. It's simply how misinformation spreads faster than fact-checking. In every case where it happens. And true crime cases are especially susceptible to it because emotional stakes are already so high before anyone's even checked a single source. We'd be doing this case a disservice if we didn't address this part directly because it's been a significant part of the public discussion from the beginning, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. Nolan Wells was, by most accounts and photos from that day, the only black person or one of very few in a larger group on Horn Island. Reverend Al Sharpton and Ben Crump have both raised this as part of the broader context of the case, not as a claim that race caused his death, but as part why the family felt an independent investigation, an independent autopsy, and sustained public pressure were necessary. Sharpton was specific about this distinction at one press conference, saying the family was not bringing race into this, but also not discounting it either. The difference may sound small, but it can significantly change how the evidence should be understood. That a careful, deliberate line, and it's worth preserving rather than flattening into something simpler. Here's what's fair to say plainly. A family's decision to question whether an investigation is being conducted with the same urgency it will receive under different circumstances is not on its own an accusation against any particular person. It's a question about trust in institutions shaped by documented history in the region and across the country. That question deserves to be taken seriously without requiring anyone to accept improving claims about specific individuals as a condition of taking it. Here's what also fair to say. None of the currently available evidence so far, the GPS data, the distress call, the mutual phone inspection agreement, the witness statements identifies any particular person as having caused Nolan's death. Speculation online that names specific individuals as killers without evidence to support that claim is not investigative journalism. It's exactly the kind of thing that can disrupt a real investigation and cause real harm to people who may be entirely innocent of anything beyond being present that day. At this stage, the safest approach is to separate what is documented from what is merely alleged. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and a responsible video about this case has to hold both without collapsing one into the other. This is exactly the kind of case where it's easy to lose a thread between valid scrutiny and unsupported accusation. And that's precisely why we go slow with these stories instead of chasing whatever's trending that hour. If you want documentaries built that way, subscribing genuinely helps more people find channels doing it right instead of the fastest possible upload. We'd appreciate it. Let's be specific about what's actually missing because vague uncertainty isn't useful to anyone. Here is what remains genuinely legitimately unsettled in the Nolan Wells case as of this recording. Both the state's official autopsy and the family's independent autopsy conducted in Washington, D.C. and funded in part by Colin Kaepernick remain unreleased. The state autopsy is reportedly still waiting on toxicology results, which can take weeks depending on lab capacity. Until either report is released. That does not answer the larger question, but it does establish an important boundary around what can be claimed. Any claim about how Nolan died, including claims that he simply drowned and claims that something more sinister occurred, is not yet supported by publicly released medical evidence between roughly 3 p.m. when Nolan was last established seen and 4:31 p.m. when GPS data confirms a boat departed the island. There is no independently verified account of what happened. Everything from that window currently comes from members of the same friend group, and their accounts contain at least one direct contradiction that has not been resolved. The mutual inspection has been agreed to, but as of the most recent public updates had not yet produced release findings. Whatever is or isn't on that device, the Snapchat activity Christine says was missing, the messages, the location history has not been established publicly by either side. According to Mississippi Today, many young people who were on Horn Island that day have not stepped forward, reportedly out of fear of becoming targets themselves. A fear that traces Tin Shepard's experience with death threats does nothing to discourage. And until more records are released, that boundary remains important for anyone discussing the case. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has publicly asked anyone with unedited photos, video, or first-hand knowledge from that day to step forward. Once the sheriff's investigation is completed, the case moves to a grand jury. Whether that results in an indictment against anyone for anything remains entirely unknown, and grand jury proceedings themselves are legally private, meaning even the process of getting there will happen mostly out of public view. This is what an honest accounting of what we don't know yet actually looks like. It's not a cliffhanger built for engagement. It's a genuine current state of an active investigation. A lot of the online debate in this case comes from a basic misconception of how medical examiners actually determine a cause of death. So, let's walk through it carefully because it explains why two separate autopsies can take this long and why that delay is not by itself inherently suspicious when a body is recovered from water. That distinction is important because the public record is still developing. A medical examiner isn't just checking for water in the lungs. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion in forensic pathology, meaning the pathologist has to rule out other potential causes of death before drowning can be established as the actual mechanism rather than simply the location where a body ended up. A person can die of a heart attack, a head injury, a drug overdose, or strangulation and then end up in a water afterward. Water in the lungs can occur in drowning deaths, but it can also occur passively after death from another cause, since a submerged body will take on water regardless of how the person died. This is exactly why the idea that you just check the lungs and claims circulating online are an oversimplification of a process that's actually built around ruling things out, not confirming one simple test result. That's where toxicology comes in. And it's also the single biggest reason both autopsies, in this case, have taken weeks rather than days. A full toxicology screen test for a wide range of substances, alcohol, prescription and illicit drugs, and in some cases, substances that require more specialized, slower lab processes to detect. For now, that point remains part of the unresolved picture rather than a settled fact. State crime labs are frequently facing backlogs, and a case doesn't get moved to front of the line just because it has national attention attached to it. That's understandably frustrating for a grieving family. It is not on its own evidence of a cover-up. There's also the question of what the body's condition after several days in Gulf water actually allows a pathologist to determine. Time and water affect a body in ways that can complicate identifying bruising, internal injuries, or other signs that might indicate what happened before death. This is part of why an independent second autopsy conducted by a pathologist with no ties to Mississippi, which is what Nolan's family arranged in Washington, D.C., can be useful. It gives a family a second set of trained eyes working independently from the state's own examiner, checking the same body for the same categories of evidence with no institutional relationship to the local investigation. Now, let's talk about what a grand jury actually is. Because this term gets thrown around online as though it is synonymous with an arrest, and it isn't. In other words, the available record does not justify turning uncertainty into certainty. A grand jury is not a trial. There's no defense attorney present. There's no judge presiding over an adversarial proceeding the way you'd see on television. It is a group of ordinary citizens in Mississippi, typically somewhere between 15 and 25 people who are shown evidence by a prosecutor and ask one question. Is there enough evidence here to support officially charging someone with a crime? That's it. They don't determine guilt. They don't hear from the defense because in a grand jury proceeding, there technically isn't one yet. That is why the timeline matters so much here, especially when different accounts are being compared. If the panel decides there's enough evidence, they issue what's called an indictment and the case moves toward an actual criminal trial where guilt or innocence would eventually be decided by a totally different jury under totally different rules. Civil rights attorney Tyler Bailey made an important point about this process in his interview with Law and Crime. Prosecutors have what's called prosecutorial discretion. Even after a grand jury referral is established, the district attorney is not legally obligated to move forward with charges. And even if a grand jury does return an indictment, the DA retains discretion over how the case proceeds from there. A grand jury referral is a significant procedural step. It is not assurance of anything in either direction. It's also worth understanding why a grand jury referral is standard procedure for any death classified as unnatural or inherently suspicious in Jackson County. According to DA's own office, meaning this step on its own doesn't necessarily represent an escalation beyond what any similarly unsettled death would receive. The difference may sound small, but it can significantly change how the evidence should be understood. What would represent an escalation is what the grand jury is ultimately shown and what they decide to do with it. That's the part nobody outside the proceeding will know until it's over because grand jury sessions are by law private. No media coverage. No public transcript. Not even Ben Crump as a family's attorney is permitted inside the room. That confidentiality is exactly why so much public scrutiny has shifted toward the pieces of evidence that can be discussed openly. The phone, the GPS data, and the distress call, because those are threads the public actually gets to follow in real time, while the grand jury process itself happens entirely out of view. If you spent any time in the comment sections around this case, you've probably seen it compared to other names, other young people who went missing or died under circumstances a family and community found difficult to accept at face value. That comparison isn't accidental, and it's worth addressing directly because it explains a lot about why this case escalated the way it did. Cases like this tend to follow a recognizable pattern once they reach a certain level of public scrutiny. At this stage, the safest approach is to separate what is documented from what is merely alleged. First, there's an initial statement from local law enforcement, often made before a full investigation is complete, that frames the death as an accident or is lacking evidence of a crime. Second, the family, often working with legal counsel, raise specific factual inconsistencies that the initial statement didn't account for. A missing report, contradictory witness accounts, evidence that didn't come back through normal channels. Third, that combination of an early, seemingly premature conclusion and a set of unsettled contradictions creates space for public distrust to grow. And that distrust gets filled often within days by online speculation that moves far faster than any actual investigation possibly could. The important distinction in every case that follows this pattern is between legitimate factual inconsistencies, the kind that a grand jury, a toxicology report, or forensic phone examination can actually resolve, and the speculative theories that grow up around them, which usually cannot be resolved by anyone because they were never built on evidence to begin with. A charge of tampering with evidence, for example, is a fundamentally different legal category from a homicide charge. It means someone allegedly concealed or altered evidence, not that they caused a death. Blending the two, or assuming one automatically implies the other, is one of the most common ways online discussion of cases like this gets ahead of what's actually been established. That does not answer the larger question, but it does establish an important boundary around what can be claimed. We've made a point of keeping those categories separate throughout this video for exactly that reason. Since a lot of you have asked variations of the same questions and comments on our previous coverage of developing cases, let's address the most common misunderstandings directly. If it was an accident, why would anyone hide anything? Panic and guilt are not the same thing, and they don't always produce the same behavior. People who have done nothing wrong sometimes still behave in ways that look inherently suspicious after a traumatic event. Leaving the scene, failing to call someone immediately, giving inconsistent accounts under stress. That's a documented phenomenon in trauma psychology, not a defense of anyone's specific actions in this case. It simply means a behavior alone without supporting physical evidence is not proof of wrongdoing. It's a reason to ask more questions, not a reason to reach a conclusion. And until more records are released, that boundary remains important for anyone discussing the case. Why hasn't anyone been arrested if there is this much smoke? Because an arrest requires probable cause tied to an actual charge, and probable cause has to be built on evidence that holds up when tested, not on public suspicion. However, as of right now, the toxicology results aren't in. The phone hasn't been fully examined by both sides, and the grand jury process hasn't concluded. An arrest made before that foundation exists would be far more likely to collapse later than one built on completed forensic work. Doesn't the family retrieving evidence themselves prove the sheriff's department did something wrong? Not necessarily. though it does raise legitimate questions about the pace and thoroughness of the initial response. Families are not always kept as informed as they should be during an active investigation, particularly in smaller jurisdictions without extensive resources for a case of this scale. That distinction is important because the public record is still developing. That is a real and valid criticism of process. It is not by itself evidence of an intentional cover-up. Is this case actually going anywhere, or will it just fade out like people worry it will? That's the most honest question of all, and we don't have a certain answer. What we can tell you is that the mutual phone inspection agreement, the grand jury referral, and the ongoing involvement of legal teams with genuine resources behind them all represent meaningful progress that a huge number of cases like this never get. Whether that motion ultimately produces answers a family can live with is something only time and the actual evidence will determine. There's a legal wrinkle buried inside the mutual phone inspection agreement that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention, and it's worth walking through because it could matter enormously if this case ever reaches an actual trial. For weeks, Nolan's phone was in the possession of the family's own independent investigators, not law enforcement. The family recovered it themselves using the Life 360 tracking app from the location where it had been left by one of Nolan's friends. For now, that point remains part of the unresolved picture rather than a settled fact. That means for a meaningful stretch of time, the single most contested piece of digital evidence in this entire case sat outside the direct custody chain that a criminal investigation would normally require. Tyler Bailey, the civil rights and criminal defense attorney who spoke with Law and Crime about this case, address exactly this problem. Multiple people having conducted a piece of evidence before it's formally logged into an official investigation can become a real issue if the case ever goes to trial. A defense attorney representing anyone eventually charged in connection with this case could argue that the evidence should be excluded, or at least that its reliability should be seriously questioned specifically because of that gap in custody. Here's the counter-argument, and it's a reasonable one. Unlike physical evidence, a weapon, a piece of clothing, digital evidence carries its own internal record-keeping, metadata, timestamps, and deletion logs exist independently of who is physically holding the phone. And a carefully conducted forensic data extraction can often show what was accessed, when, and by whom, even after the fact. That's part of why the mutual inspection agreement matters as much as it does. Having both the family forensic experts and law enforcement's experts present simultaneously watching the same extraction happen in real time creates a shared, mutually witnessed record of exactly what the phone contained at the moment of examination regardless of what happened to device beforehand. In other words, the available record does not justify turning uncertainty into certainty. It doesn't erase the earlier custody chain gap, but it does mean that from this point forward, neither side can credibly claim the other altered or selectively presented what was found. This is also, as a procedure part, why Bailey described a mutual inspection arranging itself as highly unusual. It is not standard practice for a victim's family to be granted direct simultaneous access to a forensic examination alongside law enforcement. That level of access typically only happens when there's already significant public pressure and a documented breakdown of trust between a family and the investigating agency, which is exactly what had occurred here, given the family's account receiving almost no direct communication from the sheriff's department for well over a week during an active investigation into their son's death. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, the press conferences, the subpoenas, the viral photo that turned out to be from the wrong day, Christine and Elmore Wansley also had to plan their son's funeral, and they made a deliberate choice about how to do it that's worth including here because it says something about who Nolan was to the people who actually knew him. The service was held at Center Point Church in Ocean Springs with visitation beginning at 9 in the morning followed immediately by the service. Reverend Al Sharpton officiated at the family's request. Filmmaker Tyler Perry covered the full cost of the funeral. Colin Kaepernick helped fund the independent autopsy in Washington, D.C. That is why the timeline matters so much here, especially when different accounts are being compared. Afterward, the family held what they specifically chose to call a celebration of life at the Jackson County Fairgrounds rather than a traditional repast. Christine explained that choice directly. Nolan, she said, would not want everyone sitting around crying in silence. He would want a party. She opened the celebration to former teammates, coaches, classmates from every level he played at, and notably to media as well. She let cameras into her son's funeral on purpose at a moment when she still didn't have an official cause of death, still didn't have the incident report she was legally entitled to, and was actively fighting to keep national attention on a case she worried would otherwise quietly fade. That's not a detail that resolves any of the open questions in this case, but it tells you something true about the family at the center of it. They have not at any point in this process stepped away from public scrutiny. They've invited it repeatedly, specifically because they believe visibility is what keeps an investigation honest. The difference may sound small, but it can significantly change how the evidence should be understood. Whether or not you agree with every claim that circulated around this case, that specific choice to let the cameras on the worst day of their lives because they didn't trust the alternative deserves to be understood on its own terms. Out of everything we just laid out, the missing 40 minutes, the phone data, the 2 autopsies, the witnesses who haven't stepped forward, tell me which one you think is most likely to actually break this case open. Type phone, window, or autopsy in the comments, whichever you think matters most. I read every single one, and I want to know where the audience's instincts land compared to where the investigators themselves seem to be focusing. Let's close the loop with a clear summary. Because after everything we've covered, it's worth having one place where the facts are simply sorted by category established. Nolan Wells, 18, traveled to Horn Island on July 4th with a group of friends. He was last seen around 3:00 p.m. near the island's northwest tip. At this stage, the safest approach is to separate what is documented from what is merely alleged. His friend's boat developed a mechanical failure and departed the island at 4:31 p.m. According to GPS data, Nolan did not return with them. A distress call to a towing service was placed and later obtained by NBC News. His body was recovered on July 6th and identified through dental records. His phone and car keys were recovered from friends rather than with him. The Jackson County District Attorney has established the case will go to a grand jury once the sheriff's investigation is completed. A mutual simultaneous forensic inspection of Nolan's phone has been agreed by both the family and law enforcement. Disputed whether Nolan told friends he was staying behind or whether Katie's account that he said he was heading back to the boat is accurate. Whether the clothing described in police reports matches what he was actually wearing. That does not answer the larger question, but it does establish an important boundary around what can be claimed. Whether the Snapchat account being empty reflects deleted content or an unrelated explanation whose account of that afternoon holds up once fully cross-examined. Unknown. The official cause and manner of death pending both autopsy results. What happened during the roughly 90-minute window between Nolan's last sighting and the boat's departure? What is actually contained in the phone data? Whether any additional witnesses will step forward, whether grand jury will ultimately return any indictment, and if so, against whom for what? False and established false. The claim that the June 27th pool photo depicted Nolan alive after Horn Island. The photo predates his disappearance by 8 days. And until more records are released, that boundary remains important for anyone discussing the case. The claim that the viral debate audio featured Nolan's voice. The person in that recording traced in Shepard has identified himself on the record with 2 separate outlets. That's the whole picture as it stands right now, with nothing added and nothing softened. Before we close this one out, this channel only works if people who care about getting cases like this right decide to stick around for the next one. We're not chasing whatever is trending by the hour. We're following the specific family's fight for answers for as long as it takes to get them. If that's worth your subscription, we genuinely appreciate it. It's worth ending where we started because it's the easiest thing to lose in a case this complicated. Somewhere underneath the GPS data, the mutual phone inspection, the grand jury referral, the pool photo that turned out to be from a different day entirely, is an 18-year-old who told his mother he loved her on his way out the door and never came home. That distinction is important because the public record is still developing. A kid who friends described as the one who never met a stranger. A wide receiver with a season still ahead of him. A son who asked his mom to snap one more photo before bed on ordinary nights for no reason other than wanting the moment recorded. Christine Wansley has spent the week since his death doing something no parent should have to do, fact-checking her own son's death investigation in public, correcting false claims about her family in real time, planning a funeral while simultaneously fighting for a police report she is legally entitled to receive within 72 hours and did not get for far longer than that. In one recorded message to supporters, she described grief as multi-layered. One moment able to talk about her son's stories, the next feeling like there's an elephant sitting on her chest. That is what this case actually is underneath every headline. Not a mystery to be solved for entertainment. For now, that point remains part of the unresolved picture rather than a settled fact. A family trying to survive the worst thing that has ever happened to them in front of an audience that sometimes forgets they're watching real people. Whatever the autopsy eventually shows, whatever the phone data reveals, whatever a grand jury eventually decides, Nolan Wells is a person before he was a case. And he deserves an investigation built on verified evidence, not a comment section verdict built on a photo from the wrong day and a voice that was never his. If this case develops, new autopsy results, the phone inspection findings, any grand jury movement, we will be back with fully verified update and only a verified update. If you want to be here when that happens, subscribing is genuinely the only way to make sure you don't miss it. Since we're not going to chase this story with a dozen speculative uploads between now and then, let us know in the comments which unsettled piece of this case you'll be watching for most closely. The phone, the autopsy, or the missing 40. The larger point is simple. An active investigation can contain unanswered questions without every unanswered question becoming evidence of a crime. As records, forensic results, witness accounts, and digital evidence become available, some theories may be supported while others may fall away. Until that happens, the most responsible way to tell the story is to keep the confirmed timeline, the disputed accounts, and the genuinely unknown details clearly separated. That approach may be slower, but it gives the facts room to speak for themselves.